The mirror does not simply reflect, it holds a secret covenant. And when it shatters, when the empath finally realizes that everything they thought was mutual has been one-sided, the sound is not glass breaking, but something deeper, an ancient tremor inside the psyche. This is not a moment of casual disappointment, nor just the sting of betrayal. It is a crack that splits open the architecture of identity. What once looked like love suddenly looks like a siphon. What once felt like safety reveals itself as a cage. The psyche responds not with silence, but with eruption. In Jungian language, this is no ordinary outburst. It is an alchemical explosion. The empath's pain, long compressed, becomes heat and pressure. Grief turns into fire, and fire into transformation. What leaks out is not only sorrow, but archetypal energy. Rage, despair, grief, and also a holy force whispering, "No more." This voice is not new. It has always been there. But until now, it was buried under projections. The empath mistook another's turmoil for truth, mistook cruelty for pain poorly expressed, mistook control for misunderstood love. Now the spell is undone, and the projections dissolve like mist burned away by the sun. For years, perhaps decades, the empath has lived inside the weather of other people's emotions. They have been human barometers, anticipating storms, sensing shifts in pressure. But this so-called gift was never purely divine. It was survival. It was the soul's compensation for a world that felt unpredictable, unsafe, chaotic. Sensitivity was forged as armor, not given as blessing. And in that discovery lies both devastation and liberation. To realize that one's capacity for compassion grew from an old wound is to feel both the weight of grief and the possibility of freedom. Imagine the crack in the mirror as both a wound and a doorway. On one side lies the image they thought was love. On the other, the truth they could not bear to see. The empath stands before the shards, cut and bleeding, but also luminous with possibility. Because when illusion collapses, what remains is not nothing. It is raw soul. This is why the explosion must be understood as sacred. It clears the chambers of illusion and leaves space for something real to emerge. And in this space, a question rises that pierces like lightning. If it was all a lie, then what was true? The empath feels the collapse of everything they thought defined them. Every sacrifice, every act of caretaking, every night of quiet self-erasure. It feels like death, and in a sense it is. The death of the identity built on projections. But death is also initiation. Jung called this the fertile void, a collapse that makes way for the birth of something new. This beginning, though violent, carries within it the first breath of sovereignty. It whispers that the empath does not need to bleed to prove they are alive. It insists that one's existence does not require absorbing the chaos of another. The empath trembles, recoils, questions themselves. But underneath the collapse is a seed pushing toward light. And here, before we descend deeper, let me pause to speak directly to you. Where are you right now as you listen to these words? Are you watching in the middle of the night, headphones on, feeling the echo of your own mirror crack? Or perhaps you are in daylight, letting these words accompany your morning. Wherever you are, take a moment. Comment below where you are listening from and what time it is. This is how we weave a global web of shared reflection. And if you have not already, subscribe and turn on the notifications so that each story of the psyche, each unveiling, finds its way to you. Now let us return. The empath's awakening is not just their story. It is a universal pattern. It is the story of realizing that the world you thought loved you may have only drained you, that the mirror you gazed into was never meant to give you back your soul. This shattering is terrifying, but it is also the only doorway to truth. To step through is to move beyond illusion, beyond projection, towards something greater. In the next stage, we will uncover the oldest root of this pattern, the childhood contract that silently taught the empath to survive by being useful, available, ever feeling. It is there, in those early fires, that the true origin of empathy as adaptation was formed. Beneath the eruption lies an older story, one that began long before adult relationships or the recognition of betrayal. It is the story of the child who learned, without words, that love was conditional. To be safe, to be seen, to be worthy, they had to perform usefulness. The empath's wound is not merely heartbreak in the present. It is the revival of a contract signed in the smoke of childhood, etched invisibly into the nervous system. Picture the family system as a small kingdom where the child was both servant and sentinel. Parents, carrying unspoken grief or unmet needs, could not fully behold the soul before them. The child sensed this gap, and like water finding the cracks in stone, flowed into every empty space. They became the peacekeeper, the absorber, the one who smoothed edges and softened silences. Their gift for empathy did not bloom in freedom. It sprouted in soil watered by necessity. This necessity created a kind of radar, an instinct so sharp it could detect a storm before a single drop of rain. The empath learned to read moods the way sailors read skies, not for curiosity, but for survival. Anger, tension, withdrawal, each was a signal the child translated, rushing to soothe before chaos erupted. It looked like compassion, but underneath was fear. The fear of abandonment, of rejection, of being deemed unworthy if they did not carry the emotional load of the household. And so a false belief was forged. I must feel everything so others don't have to. This contract burrowed deep, shaping identity. The child stopped asking, "What do I feel?" Instead, they asked, "What do you feel, and how do I fix it?" This is the subtle tyranny of unacknowledged parents and invisible wounds. The child adapts by erasing themselves, mistaking disappearance for love. Jung would call this an unconscious bargain with the shadow of the family. The empath took on what was disowned by the parents: rage, grief, despair, and held it as though it were their own. In this way, the empath became a living vessel for projections. But no vessel can carry another's darkness indefinitely. The weight distorts, and eventually, the vessel forgets its original form. As adults, empaths often pride themselves on this sensitivity, calling it intuition. Yet hidden within intuition is often a trauma response, an overdeveloped antenna scanning for danger, disguised as insight. What looks like foresight is often hypervigilance. What feels like kindness can be compulsion. And when this realization dawns, it is devastating. The empath sees that their so-called gift grew from absence, not abundance. Still, within this devastation lies a key. For to see the false contract is to hold the power to revoke it. The empath does not need to continue paying the debt of childhood. They do not need to keep disappearing in order to secure love. By recognizing the wound's origin, they reclaim the possibility of drawing new terms. This is the pivot point, from unconscious adaptation to conscious autonomy. To reach it, however, the empath must face grief, the grief of a childhood where love was conditional, where being themselves was never enough. It is a sacred grief, because it honors the child who carried too much. Only by naming this grief can the empath step toward freedom. So the journey continues. The explosion shattered the mirror, but the contract explains why the empath was bound to that mirror in the first place. The roots of the wound are revealed, and with them the recognition that survival patterns are not destiny. Out of this recognition comes the first fragile breath of autonomy, and yet, the transition is not smooth. To undo a contract that has guided one's entire existence feels like tearing the ground out from underfoot. Who am I if not the fixer, the feeler, the one who absorbs? The empath may stumble here, tempted to cling to old roles even as they see their cost. But it is precisely in this stumbling that the doorway opens. The next stage is terrifying and liberating all at once. To accept that intuition may have been a trauma radar, to allow collapse into the dark night, and to discover autonomy on the other side. It is here that the empath begins to breathe differently, no longer borrowing air from others, but inhaling for themselves. This is where our path turns next. The confrontation with collapse and the discovery of autonomy, the passage from contract to sovereignty. After the mirror cracks and the childhood contract is exposed, the empath stands at the threshold of collapse. To realize that your deepest sensitivity has been shaped less by blessing than by survival feels like being stripped of identity. The antenna that once felt like divine intuition suddenly looks like trauma radar. The voice you trusted to guide you now reveals itself as an echo of hypervigilance. This is where the collapse comes, not only of illusions about others, but of the self you thought you were. And collapse is not weakness. It is the soul's way of clearing the field. Jung often spoke of the necessity of breakdown as a stage of individuation. It is the darkness before dawn, the fertile void. In this void, the empath asks, if I was wrong about them, was I wrong about me? The question is not rhetorical, it is existential. The old self dissolves, and for a time there is no new self yet to take its place. This is why it feels like death. And in a sense, it is the death of false belonging. But the very collapse contains the possibility of birth. The alchemical explosion is not just the end of form, but the transformation of matter under heat and pressure. What bursts forth is raw, unfiltered life force. The empath, once defined by absorption, begins to realize they have a right to their own breath, their own heartbeat. For the first time, they taste autonomy, not as defiance, but as necessity. The first steps are fragile. Saying no feels like betrayal. Choosing solitude feels like selfishness. Allowing another's chaos to remain theirs feels almost cruel. But each of these acts is the beginning of autonomy. They are the cracks in the old contract, the first breaths of a self no longer organized around erasure. At this stage, there is often anger, not the sharp outburst of petty grievance, but a deeper flame, the recognition of how long they gave away their life force to prove worth. Anger here is a gatekeeper. It guards the threshold. To feel it is to reclaim energy that has been bleeding away for years. The empath begins to say, I do not need to suffer to prove I exist. That sentence is a revolution, and yet, anger alone is not enough. Left unchecked, it curdles into bitterness, but carried consciously, it becomes fuel. It is what Jung described as the energy of the shadow. When acknowledged, it strengthens the ego instead of sabotaging it. Anger becomes the signal that boundaries are needed, that autonomy must be defended. This is the crossing, from absorbing others to discerning self. The empath begins to notice when they are about to take on someone else's storm. They pause. They breathe. They let the storm pass without stepping into it. This pause is autonomy embodied. It is not coldness, it is clarity. And with each pause, a new identity begins to form. No longer defined by usefulness, the empath tastes life without the contract. They realize they can feel their own peace without validating it through another's chaos. They can exist without bleeding for proof. The psyche, once organized around adaptation, begins to reorganize around sovereignty. Of course, the process is messy. There are relapses, moments of self-doubt, nights of longing for the old role. But each time they return to the new breath, the new boundary, they strengthen the sovereign within. It is not perfection that matters here. It is practice. Practice builds presence. This is the paradox. What looks like collapse is actually construction. What feels like death is actually initiation. By facing the truth that intuition was often hypervigilance, the empath learns to distinguish genuine inner guidance from trauma's whisper. That distinction is the seed of autonomy. The journey is far from complete, but the compass has shifted. The empath is no longer defined by projections or contracts. They are stepping into a new archetype, though they may not yet have words for it. Soon, those words will arrive. The birth of the sovereign. And so the path bends again. From collapse and fragile autonomy, we move toward transformation into something entirely different. Not a mirror, not a sponge, but a flame and a sword. No longer a mirror, no longer a sponge. This is the moment when the empath begins to step into the shape of the sovereign. It is not a simple switch, not a costume change from victim to victor, but a metamorphosis born in fire. The empath who once absorbed every vibration in the room now learns to anchor in their own heartbeat. They discover that sovereignty is not about isolation. It is about presence so rooted that it cannot be stolen. The sovereign is not defined by what they give away, but by what they hold sacred. Where once the empath blurred the boundary between self and other, now they feel the line like a pulse of light. They begin to say no, not as a wall, but as an altar. Each no is a consecration of their own being, a reminder that their existence does not depend on usefulness. Boundaries are no longer apologies. They are declarations of life. To be sovereign is to remember. Remembering that before they were drained, they were radiant. Before they were deceived, they were sacred. Before they were used, they were whole. This remembrance does not erase the pain of betrayal, but it reframes it. Betrayal becomes the initiation, the passage through which the empath discovers the flame within. The imagery shifts here from mirror to fire, from sponge to sword. The empath who once reflected others now illuminates themselves. The one who once soaked up chaos now cuts through illusion. The sovereign walks into rooms not searching for who needs saving, but listening for resonance. They no longer confuse need with connection or dependency with love. They do not beg to be seen, because they know they are already seen by their own soul. And in this state, anger finds its rightful place, not as poison, but as guardian. The sovereign honors anger as the gatekeeper at the threshold, thanking it for its protection but refusing to let it dictate the journey. Anger opens the door, but remembrance walks the path. Dreams often surge during this phase, carrying symbols from the unconscious to confirm the transformation. A woman walks through a burning house yet emerges untouched. A serpent sheds its skin and becomes a phoenix. A mirror turns into a doorway. These are not random images. They are archetypal stamps of initiation. The unconscious speaks in symbols when words are not enough, offering reassurance that the soul has crossed a boundary into sovereignty. And sovereignty is not pride. It is not aloofness or disdain. It is quiet fire, sacred stillness, a clarity that cannot be bartered. The sovereign does not need to argue boundaries. They embody them. They do not chase, beg, or plead. They rest in presence. And in that stillness, paradoxically, they become magnetic. People feel drawn not to the empath's self-erasure, but to their authenticity. The sovereign radiates what Jung called individuation, the soul fully alive in its unique form. This transition is not without resistance. Old habits whisper, "Prove your love by disappearing. Show your worth by absorbing." But the sovereign answers, "I remember who I was before the lie." This remembrance is both shield and compass. It allows them to step into relationships not as caretakers of another's chaos, but as equals, whole unto themselves. And so, the empath becomes flame. Not flame that consumes recklessly, but flame that illumines. They become sword. Not sword that wounds indiscriminately, but sword that cuts illusion from truth. In this transformation, the sovereign empath claims their own center and becomes unmovable. The journey does not end here. The sovereign still has to learn how to interpret the language of dreams, to integrate symbols, and to navigate the deep messages of the unconscious. This is the work of initiation, where the psyche begins to show visions that confirm and challenge in equal measure. Thus we move forward into the sacred dreamscape, where the unconscious sends its signals. Burning houses, serpents, phoenixes, and mirrors that open as doorways. The sovereign must learn to read these visions as maps for the next phase of becoming. When sovereignty first ignites, the unconscious often speaks in symbols so vivid they refuse to be ignored. Dreams carry the messages that waking life cannot yet frame in words. This is not imagination, but initiation. Ritual guidance emerging from the depths. A woman walks unharmed through a burning house, and the fire does not consume her. Instead, it reveals her invulnerability. A serpent sheds its skin and becomes a phoenix, showing that transformation requires both death and resurrection. A mirror ceases to reflect and instead becomes a doorway, an invitation to step through illusion into authenticity. These dreamscapes are not decorations. They are thresholds. In Jungian thought, dreams function as direct communications from the unconscious, offering archetypal images that compress complex truths into symbolic form. The empath, now on the cusp of sovereignty, begins to receive these symbols as proof of the inner passage. The unconscious is saying, the old self has burned, the skin has been shed, the doorway is open, step through. For the empath, learning to read these dreams is part of the individuation process. They must treat dreams not as puzzles to be solved, but as rituals to be honored. Each image is a message from the deep self, affirming the transition away from wounded identification. The fire is not punishment, but purification. The serpent does not die, but transforms. The mirror does not trap, but reveals hidden thresholds. To carry these dreams consciously is to integrate their message into waking life. The empath begins to notice resonance. Fire in a sunset, a doorway glimpsed in daily life, the quiet pulse of renewal within their own breath. This symbolic literacy marks the movement from unconscious survival to conscious initiation. No longer ruled by inherited contracts, the empath becomes apprentice to their own soul. And yet, dream symbols also carry challenge. They remind the empath that sovereignty is not without cost. To walk through fire requires surrendering what cannot withstand flame. To shed skin means letting go of identities that once felt protective. To pass through a mirror door means leaving behind the comfort of reflection and facing the unknown. Dreams offer both blessing and demand. Will you release what is false so that what is true may live? In this way, the empath's nights become classrooms. Sleep is no longer escape but encounter. The unconscious calls forth images that mirror the psychic shift, the collapse of projection, the birth of boundaries, the flame of sovereignty. And in responding to these calls, the empath rehearses their new way of being. Jung noted that when archetypal dreams appear repeatedly, it is a sign that the psyche is undergoing structural change. For the empath, this repetition is confirmation. The old wound is no longer master. The soul has begun to reconfigure around authenticity. Each dream acts as a ceremonial drumbeat, marking progress on the inner path. Gradually, the empath learns not to resist these dreams, but to embody them. They do not wake asking, "What does it mean?" but rather, "What does it require of me today?" The fire requires courage. The serpent requires letting go. The mirror requires stepping across thresholds. Dreams become not just stories of the night, but instructions for the day. This is the passage across the threshold, where sovereignty begins to feel less like an idea and more like a lived truth. And yet, the sovereign must still sharpen one more skill: discernment. Without discernment, even sovereignty can falter, for the world is full of illusions disguised as needs, manipulations masquerading as vulnerability. Thus, the journey continues. From the sacred language of dreams, we turn now to the practice of discernment, the art of seeing clearly who truly seeks connection and who seeks only to control. Dreams have opened the gate, but it is discernment that teaches the sovereign how to walk through the world with clarity. Without discernment, empathy can still be hijacked, turned again into service, into sacrifice, into the old pattern of erasure. This is why the final stage of the empath's awakening is not only compassion, but compassion refined by boundaries. Discernment begins with a shift in perception. The empath no longer enters a room scanning for who needs saving. They enter listening for resonance. Instead of being pulled toward desperation, they are drawn toward authenticity. They begin to see the subtle difference between genuine vulnerability and manipulation disguised as need. They notice when helplessness is not a condition, but a strategy, a way to gain power by drawing others into endless rescue. This seeing is sharp, almost surgical, and yet it is not cold. It does not sever connection. It purifies it. The empath learns that love without respect is a ghost. Compassion without discernment is self-harm, and unity without authenticity is a prison. These principles become their compass. They no longer confuse dependency with intimacy or control with care. They see through the eyes of the initiated soul. Boundaries, once painful to set, now radiate naturally. They do not need to explain them, justify them, or argue them. Boundaries become embodied, felt in posture, voice, gaze. Others sense it, and manipulation falters before it can even begin. The sovereign empath carries an energy that says, "I will not disappear for you. I exist fully, and in my wholeness I meet you." With this clarity comes a profound change in presence. The empath no longer performs pain nor displays healing. They do not try to prove worth through sacrifice or seek validation through service. They simply are. This being is magnetic, not because it craves attention, but because authenticity draws attention without effort. The empath's stillness becomes a force field. Their gaze unmasks falsehood without confrontation. Their silence speaks louder than their old sacrifices ever did. And in this presence, The empath integrates what once shattered them. The memory of illusion is not erased. It becomes the texture of wisdom, the fuel of discernment. Pain is carried not as a wound, but as a chalice, a vessel in which transformation brewed. They do not deny the past. They consecrate it. Every betrayal, every collapse, every dream symbol becomes part of the sovereign architecture of the self. From here, relationships transform. The empath no longer kneels before the false gods of people-pleasing. They bow only to the altar of the deep self, the divine spark that endured the fires of illusion and emerged not bitter, but wise. And when they love now, their love is clean. It is not clinging or desperate, not performance or self-abandonment. It is presence. Love offered without disappearing. Compassion given without erasure. This is wholeness. Not perfection, not invulnerability, but integration. The empath, once reactive, becomes reflective. Once compulsively giving, they become consciously present. Once fragmented, they become whole. And in that wholeness, they no longer see themselves as wounded healers, but as healed warriors of light. Souls who do not absorb darkness, but transmute it. The explosion that once seemed like an ending has revealed itself as a doorway. The empath steps through, no longer guided by the eyes of the wounded child, but by the eyes of the initiated soul. Nothing is more powerful than a soul that has remembered its light after being convinced it was darkness. And so, the journey that began with a cracked mirror culminates in sovereignty. What was once projection becomes presence. What was once compulsion becomes choice. What was once erasure becomes radiant being. This is what it means to walk as whole. The story does not truly end here, for wholeness is not a final state, but a living practice. Each day, the sovereign empath chooses resonance over rescue, clarity over illusion, presence over disappearance. In that choice, the revolution continues, not as battle, but as quiet fire. The lie was never really about the other. It was about the silent belief, planted in childhood and rehearsed in adulthood, that love required disappearance. That to be worthy, one had to carry, absorb, anticipate, dissolve. This belief was the hidden tyrant behind every sacrifice, every projection, every collapse. And when the mirror cracked, when the empath saw the narcissist for what they were, that tyrant was finally exposed. Here lies the true reversal, the realization that sovereignty was never about conquering others, but about reclaiming the self. The empath no longer measures worth by usefulness, no longer equates silence with safety, no longer mistakes chaos for intimacy. The lie has been unmasked, and in its place stands a new truth. Existence itself is enough. This revolution within does not roar, it glows. The sovereign empath does not need to argue boundaries, explain their choices, or justify their presence. They radiate it. Their very being is the declaration, I am here, I am whole, I am no longer for barter. And with this wholeness comes freedom. They are free to love without disappearing, to give without bleeding, to stay without losing themselves. They are free to walk away when compassion is demanded without respect. They are free to remain still in the face of manipulation, knowing that silence can be more powerful than any protest. This freedom is not without responsibility. The sovereign empath carries wisdom that others may not yet see. They discern when to speak and when to remain silent, when to step in and when to let another face their own shadow. They do not confuse control with care or pity with love. Their compassion is fierce, their presence discerning, their love clean, from the cracked mirror to the fertile void. from collapse to flame, from dream symbols to boundaries embodied. The journey of the empath is the story of transformation itself. It is the path of individuation, the alchemy of the soul. And so we close, not with an ending, but with a beginning. For the sovereign empath, every day is a new chance to walk differently, to seek resonance, to embody truth, to live as light remembered. They are no longer the wounded child peering through illusions, but the initiated soul standing in wholeness. They sit, they sense, they wait. They are magnetic. They are sovereign. They simply are.